into the bye, 49ers get Jacksonville coming out. Who is your offensive MVP? Who's your defensive MVP for the 49ers at this point?
Offensive MVP has to be Christian McCaffrey, and that's with him not looking great, I'd say, over the last 3 weeks. He's looked a little bit banged up, and when Kyle Shanahan talks about the team looking slow, looking tired, I think McCaffrey's been in that equation, but he's been tremendous this year, and without him, this Niners team just isn't the same offensively. So Christian McCaffrey would be my offensive MVP. Defensive MVP is tough because nobody's really played well and they've been exposed in these last 3 games. You know, you talked about the missed tackles from Fred Warner, but I feel like every single week from a leadership standpoint, playing standpoint, he's one of the only guys who's really brought it all 8 weeks of the year. So I'm going to go Fred Warner as my defensive MVP, but I can't really pinpoint a specific name defensively because these struggles have kind of overshadowed what should be one of the league's best defenses.
You know, the two guys, and I agree with both those. I would probably go with Warner, and you got to go with CMC. CMC is, you know, I mean, he's top 5 in the MVP ballots in the NFL. You know, leads the league in rushing yardage. He's got the most receiving yards among all running backs. He's got 13 total touchdowns. He's your offensive MVP for sure. And I would go probably with Warner as well. The two guys that I'm having a hard time kind of deciding good year, bad year on are Brandon Ayuk and Nick Bosa. It's easy to watch the film and see that Bosa commands doubles. Bosa draws penalties against him. Bosa's still very much a force. But he did have 18 and a half sacks last year, and he only has 2 right now. So if you're one of these where the sacks guys, you may be saying Nick hasn't been good. Now, John Lynch would say, hey, man, if you don't think Nick's been good, you don't know ball, and you're not watching close enough. So there's that. Then on the other side, and I got into it last night on my stream with some guys, and they said, give me your thoughts. Somebody in the chat said, what do you think of Brandon Ayuk's year? And to me, I'm disappointed in the year that he's had. And then yet, if you look at his numbers, there's some good numbers there, right? He's 10th in receiving yards. He missed a game. He's got the 10th most first downs in the league. But he also, the way Bosa's got 2 sacks, he only has 2 touchdowns. And if you had said to me, man, watching him this summer, what do you expect? I would have said, Brandon Ayuk is going to the moon. He's going to have a career year. He's going to have 10 to 12 touchdowns. And maybe he still will. But to me, the lack of sack production from Bosa and the lack of touchdown production from Ayuk is surprising. Give me your thoughts on those two guys.
Yeah. And again, like I was talking about this a little bit earlier, what's really annoyed me during this 3-game losing streak, it's the sloppiness, being ill-prepared, as I talked about, but it's these elite level players not playing up to their expectations. Now, it's crazy because when you look at Bosa's in-depth numbers, 92 overall Pro Football Focus grade, 80.5 run defense grade. I always think he's been a little bit underrated there because everybody focuses in on the sacks. That's the juicy number. A pass rush grade of 91.6. He has 279 pass rush snaps this year with 44 total pressures, 25 hurries. But the lack of sacks has certainly been a problem. What's odd is that PFF doesn't do half sacks. They do full sacks, and they have Bosa's having 4 sacks, but it really is 2.5. And he's missed out on sacks by just milliseconds. So he's been so close to finishing. And then you look at Brandon Ayuk. Like Bosa last week, there's no excuse for him to miss those tackles in the backfield against the run. And what really bothered me is that he's the guy who addresses this team before game day. He's the highest paid non-quarterback in the history of the NFL. When you're paid that much money, you are held to a standard. And that last Joe Mixon run, had an opportunity to set the edge, had an opportunity to tack him in the backfield. He whiffed. And then he kind of flailed his arms when he looked back. He's like, what, nobody's there on that second or third level to make the tackle after me? That is not what leaders do. So he has not played up to his level of just elite level potential, right? And then for Brandon Ayuk, got off to a really good start this year. Inexcusable to have some of the drops that he's had the last couple of weeks, especially at the end of the first half last week. You have an opportunity to really seize the momentum of that football game. Brock Purdy made that incredible throw to George Kittle down the seam, and then he throws it to Ayuk, who had an opportunity to get the Niners into field goal range for Jake Moody. Ball clanks off his face mask. Those types of plays can't happen, and they have been happening. And that's why the Niners have been struggling so much. But you're right. Like, you look at Ayuk's numbers, 109 yards week 1, 57 yards, 76, 58, 148, 43, and then 129. That was going from most recently to week 1. So that 129 was against Pittsburgh, in opposite direction there. That's my beat. But yeah, he has had a good season. But statistically, it's one of those things where his numbers look a little bit better than how he's been playing. So I have been a little bit disappointed in him, because he's had an opportunity with Deebo Samuel out to be that number one guy. He has all the flash to be that number one guy. He has all the ability, but you just can't drop the football like he's been dropping the football from normally a guy who's very sure-handed.
And most underrated 49er. Who do you think's had an underrated good year? And it's not, and this is always difficult, these underrated, overrated, because it's all based on a rating that, it's kind of like, well, what rating are you referring to? So it's kind of like your perception. But I know you're, deep on the Niners, and you're, seeing all the different angles. Is there somebody that you thought, you know what, thought he was going to be this, but he's really that? And thus I'll say, you know what, kind of underrated.
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts here. With how Brock Purdy has ended in the fourth quarter of the last 2 games, a lot of people think that he's been awful in the last 2 or 3 games. In the last 8 quarters, 6 of them, I think he's played tremendous football. And the Niners' recent struggles have overshadowed how well he's played this year. I actually think that you can put him in that category of being somewhat underrated. If you want to go to a position that maybe the common fan doesn't focus in on, Aaron Banks, I think he's given up 1 sack this year. The Pro Football Focus numbers aren't great, but sometimes they get too nerdy. And I know that I've alluded to them at points in this show, but sometimes you have to look at the eye test, right? He's given up 1 sack this year. I think he's been a little bit underrated. I think a lot of people panicking about George Kittle is a little bit overblown. I think that he draws very important assignments as a blocker sometimes, depending on the game plan and the matchup, where he's not always used as much in the pass game as I would like. But he looks to be every bit of the player that signed that contract extension a few years ago. So that's offense. Defense, I think Eric Armstead has historically been underrated. Again, everybody focuses in on the sacks, but he's a really impactful player. He was the only guy who got home last week with those 2 sacks against Joe Burrow. And Talanoa Hufanga fallen a little bit under the radar. He gets a little bit too over-aggressive at times and over-pursues, but I think he's been pretty solid this year. I would say Mooney Ward, I think that he can be overshadowed too, but he's been picked apart a little bit. But I think that's because of the Niners' defensive line not getting home. So those are kind of the names that immediately come to mind for me.
Yeah, I think Banks is a great one. I think Lenore has been kind of underrated.
Lenore's a good one, yeah.
Lenore's been solid.